Okay, today we are going to be looking at Roman numeral 3, and we're going to be specifically focusing on different types of water pollution. So we're going to talk about what the difference is between point source pollution and non-point source pollution. We're going to talk about three different types of water pollution. So this will be Roman numeral 3A. Pollution of any kind can be defined as an undesirable change to the environment. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about water, air, whatever kind of pollution you're talking about. If you have some kind of thing that is there that is undesirable, or it degrades the quality of that particular thing, then that would be considered pollution. The water pollution is the addition of anything into the water that degrades its quality. And we're not talking about whether it degrades it a little bit or a lot. It's just if it degrades it at all. C, two major causes of water pollution are industrialization and the human population explosion. Just like those two things have been responsible for a lot of issues, they're also the major causes of water pollution. D, developed countries tend to have most water pollution from industry, while developing countries tend to have most water pollution due to sewage and agricultural runoff. So even though both types of countries have water pollution, they tend to be caused by different things. I do want you to notice also in your notes there's a typo, and so just go with it. There's actually two letter D's right here, and this is the second one. D, water pollution can come from two types of sources. Number one, point source pollution, and we will define that in just a minute. And number two, non-point source pollution. So let's talk about what each of these are. Now these are categories. E, point pollution or point source pollution is water pollution discharged from a single source. So in other words, you have a pipe that has pollution running out of it. You can see the pipe, or at least you know its specific location, so you can identify exactly where it's coming from. This type is the easiest to control because the location of the discharge point is known. So for example, if you have a leaking septic tank, or if you have water being discharged by a particular industry, so like in this picture, if you have a pipe that has obvious water coming out of it that's dirty, then that would be point source pollution. F, non-point source pollution sources are when pollution comes from many different sources instead of one specific site, and it can't be easily located. So if you stop to think about it, which type would you suppose would be the easiest to do something about? Point source pollution or non-point source? So an example of non-point source pollution would be rain washing oil off of a road into a water supply. So, you know, you've got lots and lots of cars going over lots and lots of roads and leaving oil residue. So whenever it rains, all of those roads then have oil that washes off of it into a water supply. You can see that there's not one specific location. So that would be much harder to control. This would be an example in the picture that when it rains, the water then runs into storm drains, and that carries oil with it into the water supply. G, wastewater is one of several major classifications of polluted water. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean sewage. Wastewater could just be the water that drains out of your sink when you've washed your hands, for instance. Number one, it is water that contains waste from homes or industries. Number 2, most wastewater flows into municipal, that means city, wastewater treatment plants where it is filtered and treated until it's clean enough to return to a river or lake. Now, we were going to try to go to the wastewater treatment plant as a field trip. We've done that the last couple of years, but unfortunately all the rain we got at Christmas caused enough damage to the wastewater treatment plant here in in Coleman, that they are not allowing visitors to come in right now because they're having to do repair work. So we won't get to see it this year. Now, notice it says until it's clean enough to return to a river or lake. The regulations for wastewater are not that the water has to be to the point of being sterile when you put it back. It only has to be as clean as the water you took it out of. Number 3, treatment of wastewater can include several steps. Number 1, primary treatment is filtering with screens to remove about 60% of solids, but only about a third of other waste material. So when you've got wastewater coming into a treatment plant, the first step, the primary treatment, is to run it through filters. And then that takes out a lot of the stuff that's in the water. Then you do other processes to clean up the water after that. B, secondary treatment is a biological process where bacteria is used to break down the waste. So in other words, they let nature do what it does. They take the water and they allow it to settle in ponds, in big pond areas, and they add bacteria to it, and it breaks down the waste that's there. Oxygen is usually added to stimulate bacteria so that it consumes or surrounds waste. Now, we are going to do a lab with this chapter where I'm going to give you a sample of dirty water, and you're going to follow several steps that are very similar to what they do in a treatment plant. And when you get through, if you've done all of them correctly, the water will be crystal clear. So, and all of these are the steps that they use. Now notice, they're not adding any chemicals to it that they'll have to remove later. That's the point, is they're trying to hold down the cost, and they're also they're trying to do things that are natural. So if you look at this picture, if this is the wastewater treatment plant, you'll notice right here in this area you have what's called a primary sedimentation tank. So they run the water in there, it's run through screens, and then they allow it, they do some other stuff to it, but they allow it to settle. Some of the particles in it that got through the screens will then settle to the bottom. They then run it to here. It looks like a fountain where they spray it up in the air, and it allows oxygen to mix with it. That allows bacteria then to decompose a bunch of it, and then they take it into the next tank where they have secondary treatments that we'll talk about in a minute. Finally, the water is clear. The only thing left is to kill anything that might be living in it, like parasites, viruses, and that's when you take it to this tank and you treat it with chlorine, and that kills anything that might be living. C, tertiary treatment is a combination of chemical and physical processes that speed up the previously mentioned processes. These processes can be very expensive. So in other words, the more chemical, the more different steps you add in here, the slower the process can go. Another thing that can be done is in each of these steps in here, you can probably do a few more things. If you're in a big city like Birmingham, then there's so much wastewater coming in that it's hard to treat it all quickly enough. So they may have to do some other steps in here than what you see right here. D, disinfection is the addition of chemicals, usually chlorine compounds, to kill disease-carrying organisms. These diseases can include cholera, typhoid, and hepatitis. So any kind of remaining bacteria or any kind of parasites or viruses, that's what disinfection is for. And usually it's chlorine in order to kill those. H, one product of treating wastewater is sludge. Sludge is the solid material left over after the treatment process. So in other words, when you've screened all that stuff out, when you've allowed all the stuff to settle to the bottom, like we were talking about, eventually you have to do something with that solid material. That's called sludge. So there's two ways to get rid of it. Number one, if the sludge contains toxins that can't be removed, it has to be incinerated and burned. So in other words, if there's stuff in it, like metals, heavy metals, things like that, then a lot of times there's nothing you can do with it except to incinerate it. Well, excuse me, I said incinerated and burned. It's incinerated and buried. So basically it goes to a landfill. Number two, if the toxins can be removed, the sludge can be used as fertilizer. So they can take that material and spread it on fields as a type of fertilizer to help with crops that are growing. I, when lakes and slow-moving streams contain an abundance of nutrients, they are eutrophic. Now this process we have talked about before, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it because we've mentioned it more than once. Although eutrophication is a natural process, it can be accelerated when fertilizers and sewage are added to the water supply. This is called artificial eutrophication and can lead to fish kills. So if you'll remember, you have the fertilizers going into the water. They fertilize the algae just like they would on land. The algae then begins to decompose. That causes bacteria to multiply. Both of them use up oxygen out of the water, and at that point anything else living in the water like fish can't survive because there's not enough oxygen. Well, when you do this due to fertilizer and sewage, it's called artificial eutrophication. Some areas have banned the use of phosphates in detergents and fertilizers since phosphates can cause eutrophication. Phosphates also were in detergents a long time ago, and they've banned them out of detergents also for the same reason. So if you see this picture, the one on the left is showing a lake where there is not any eutrophication going on. The one on the right is showing a lake where eutrophication is occurring. You can see it's green. The water looks green due to the increase in algae, and eventually any fish or anything living in it can eventually die. J, thermal pollution occurs when heated water is added back to a body of water that's at a lower temperature. So in other words, if you have an industry that's pulling water out of the river or stream and using it to cool down the processes they're using, they are required by federal law to cool that water back down before they put it back in the water. Most, if you look at the next sentence, this can lead to the death of aquatic organisms which have a narrow range of temperature tolerance. Most things that live in the water can only survive in a very narrow temperature range, unlike us. We can survive in a pretty big range of temperature, but things in the water can't. So if you add heated water back into the river, you can cause it prevents aquatic organisms from surviving. It can also lead to a decrease in the oxygen in the water. The warmer liquids are, the less gases that can stay dissolved. That's why a Coke on the counter becomes flat quicker than a Coke in the refrigerator. When the liquid's warmer, the carbonated gas in the Coke will escape out. The same thing's true with oxygen in water. So when you look at this picture, you've got the industry adding heated water back, and it causes a decrease in the fish population. If the fish can't survive, that's going to change whatever the food web is, and all of it is due to the lower amount of dissolved oxygen because the water is warm. And that's all for today.